sit down and have coffee with anybody in the Bible, you can't say Jesus.
Right, right.
Who do you think it would be?
Wow. I would probably say one of two people. I love Joseph, and probably out of the Old Testament, probably Joseph, and then out of the New Testament Bible character, it would probably be John or Peter. One of the disciples, probably.
That's John or Peter, though. That's a big contrast. Like you're going to be having two probably totally different conversations.
Yeah, no, for real.
So when you say Joseph, why would you choose Joseph?
I think I'm so intrigued by his, not only his character and his integrity, but just his willingness to trust the Lord through some very incredible and different stages in his life, and he kind of had 4 stages where, God gave him a vision, God gave him a dream, God showed him something, and so he had to carry that dream, and then he had a season of where he was a betrayal, very, very deep betrayal, and then he had a season of, he had to serve, and then he had a season where he was imprisoned.
Yeah.
And through all those 4 seasons, and then he had a season where he was forgot about, just completely forgot about, and so going through that very deep betrayal, going through that season of service and being lied on and lied about, and we all know what those can identify with all of his seasons, and having to wait for a dream God gave me, God gave him, and having to wait for that. And then, God, did you really talk to me? Was that really a dream? Was that really a vision? Or was it just the pizza talking, kind of thing? But man, all through that process, he not only maintained his integrity when he could have gave up on God, he could have gave up, on his dream, on the vision, on what God showed him. He could have lost himself in any one of those times. He stayed true. And in every one of those times, he still acknowledged God, loved God. He still served God. He interpreted dreams in the prison. He was still pointing back to God, even in the midst of being in prison for something he didn't do, for being lied upon, and then forgotten. And then they call him out, and he said, I don't have anything for you.
Yeah.
But instead of that, I serve a God who knows,
Yeah.
Let me tell you what God says. He is the one true God. Even though, how many of us, if God gave us a vision, not only can maintain our character through all of those different walks of life, and then at the end say, I serve a God who, I serve the one true God in spite of all that, And for me, that's something that has just kind of tried to hold me all the way through that. No matter what's going on in my life, I know God has called me. I know, he's placed me. People ask me all the time about, how I lasted 20 years in recovery or lead and celebrate recovery. God put me there.
Yeah.
And he was faithful to me all the way through. And so just kind of watching that vision all the way through, no matter what was going on in my personal life and my family life and my, I've got miracles I could share from that end.
Yeah.
And just what God was doing on the back end while I was faithful on this end of what God had called me to. And so, man, to me, that's just, is amazing, his story.
Joseph's a good one I never thought about. So if you're listening and you don't know who Joseph is, let's do a little breakdown of Joseph, just kind of walk through Joseph's story. So if you want to start, and there's a couple areas where I'll jump in, but
Sure.
so Joseph basically went through everything kind of bad you could go through.
He was, I think he was the 11th of 12 sons. So he had 10 older brothers and 1 younger brother, and he was his father's favorite. He was the favorite. Back in those days, his father had 2 different wives, and he was the first son of his favorite wife. And so anyway, and so all the older brothers were jealous.
Yeah.
And so God gave Joseph a vision, a dream, and that, there were 10 stalks of grain and they would bow down to one stalk of grain or something along those lines. And then and then the moon and the stars and how they would worship. And so basically saying that the older brothers were going to bow to him,
Joseph,
essentially.
yeah.
And so, he didn't use a lot of wisdom then when he went and told his brothers that he had this dream and what he thought it meant. And they didn't like it. They didn't like him already.
Yeah.
And so they wanted to kill him right there. And so he had an older brother that said, we can't kill him. He's our father's favorite.
Yeah.
So let's throw him in this pit. And so they threw him in this pit. And then these traders came along from Egypt. And so he was sold into slavery. So he spent some years in slavery and wound up in Potiphar's house. He was like second, I think, in charge there to the Pharaoh. And his wife took a liking to Joseph and then tried to get him to sleep with her and turn against his integrity. And he refused to do it. And so she lied and said he tried to rape her, feeling that guilt or whatever. And so Joseph was then thrown in jail and spent time in jail where he still worked for God, and God was still working on the back end.
Yeah.
And spent time in jail and interpreted some dreams for a baker and a cupbearer to the Pharaoh, and told them what their dreams were going to be, and just remember me when you get out is all he asked them.
Yeah.
And obviously they got out and didn't remember him.
Mm-hmm.
But everything he interpreted came true. And then finally, after some years, the Pharaoh began to have some dreams, and nobody could tell him what his dreams meant. And then the cupbearer remembered a guy in jail that had told him about a dream he had had. And it was just God navigating and putting Joseph in place for a time to save an entire people, is essentially what was happening. But Joseph, what intrigues me is Joseph didn't know that at the time that God was working in his life. Mm-mm. It just looked like bad things were happening to him. And sometimes for us, that's what happens is it just looks like bad things are happening, or we're not catching a break, or things are just going wrong, or why is this happening to me, or why am I here in this place? Why am I stuck in this place? Why is this going on? And sometimes it's just God navigating and putting us in a position to do something big if we can just hold on. And I think that's, and just remember the promises and remember what God said about us, all the way through that process. Because
remembering that dream, that he shouldn't have shared with his brothers.
Yeah, obviously, obviously he was immature.
Yeah,
and sometimes not everything that happens to us is the devil either. Sometimes it's our own immaturity, our own actions. I think we blame the devil for a lot of the things that we do to ourselves.
Yeah,
right. The devil's been on me all day long. No. I've been making bad decisions all day long.
And if you have a chance, that's a really good, whether you read the Bible by yourself or you do a Bible study, it's such a good story to read. I remember the first time I read it, because I was raised in church, but kind of coloring book style. Nothing against the church, but I just never went past the level of understanding Noah's Ark. So when I was reading that, I was like, this is bogus.
Yeah.
Like the whole thing. First off, it was like, you shouldn't have shared your dream.
Right.
But gosh, they responded really dramatically.
Right.
And then you're like, okay, he's starting to get favor again. And then the girl says that he did something he didn't do.
Right.
And then you're like, his story's over.
Yeah.
Him being an outsider and getting accused of that, there's no way this dude's ever getting out of prison.
Right.
And then every interaction in life is so important.
Yeah.
If God has given you a gift, had he not shared his gift with the cupbearer and the baker, had he not done that, even though they did forget him, he would have they would have never been able to give the information.
Yeah.
And what's beautiful with that is God gave him this promise. He goes through all this stuff, and then what happens when it's all said and done, then brothers are bowing it down before him, and he saves his people.
Saves his family, reconciles with his brother, saves his people, becomes second in command, the richest man next to Pharaoh in all the world.
Which makes no sense.
Makes no sense. But, and again, it's kind of one of those things. He could have sat in his anger, his frustration. He could have sat in his hurt. We talk about hurts, habits, and hang-ups. He could have sat in his hurts. He could have sat in those hang-ups. He could have sat in those betrayals. He could have sat in all of that stuff. But through all that process, he chose to forgive. He chose to love. He chose to honor the Lord all the way through. And God just continued to navigate his life to work out not only for his good, but for the good of everyone that was connected to him. Man, and that's the lesson for me. And is just how do I adopt that same mentality and that same thought process in my life? That no matter what's going on the back end, God's given me a call. He's given me, dreams. He's given me visions. He's given me a call. How do I navigate life, holding on to those things and not sulking when things don't go my way, or, when the bills come due and there's not all the money there that I need, or, this, that, or the other, somebody's lying on me, or somebody's leaving, or somebody's, stabbing in the back, or whatever is happening is happening. How do I continue to forgive? How do I continue to honor the Lord and hold on to that while he navigates my life and puts me where he wants to? And that's been a little bit of my testimony that I can see is how God has navigated my life, to help lots of people that's been connected to me and around me, and I've seen that, and I've seen God do that. And I think that's why Joseph's special to me. I can see some of myself in that story to some degree.
I think what gets me is Joseph, out of everybody in the Bible, until maybe Jesus came along, had more of a right to play victim than maybe anybody that ever existed. He had more of a right to be bitter and angry. And there's a lesson in that is he didn't play victim.
Right.
He didn't let that anger and that bitterness get the best of him. And as we walk through life, you can see it and it weighs on people. Some people play these things happen. And I'm not saying some things happen to people and they are victims. I'm not saying that 100%, and they have the right to feel like victims. But a lot of times, especially like with men, that, a couple people will do them wrong, and instead of continuing and not caring that, they carry bitterness, which is basically a disease in your heart. They carry like a victim mentality of like, I'm going to sit in this prison and I'm going to tell everybody how wrong my brothers did me. But if you continue through, you know what I mean? And because he didn't have that bitterness in his heart, and because he didn't play victim, his brothers were all standing in front of him at his will. He could have done anything he wanted to, and had his heart not been right, and had he not been in alignment with God. And even before, he's showing the heart of like what we're supposed to do. Yeah. Had he not worked through those things, they would have all had their heads chopped off or ended up in prison. Yeah. Which the impact that would have had. Right. Now you got to keep reading through the Bible, but the impact that we can't even tell you. I have no idea the magnitude of him being bitter and getting revenge opposed to forgiving, what that would have done.
Well, it could have wiped out a whole generation of people, of a family. Yeah. And people that were tied to the children of Israel, and and all that, and I think God would have had a plan.
He would have definitely had a plan,
but again, people would have suffered and people would have died, and we'd have lost a generation. And again, I wonder, which makes me wonder how many generations have been lost because we chose to stay in our hurts, stay in our bitterness, stay in our frustration, our unforgiveness. Those things that happen to us. Instead of allowing God to have them and allowing him to navigate our life, And so that's why I like Joseph. You can look at Joseph's story, you can find everything to navigate life almost, from forgiveness to honor, to integrity, to all of those things. It's such an interesting story. He's an interesting individual.
If you don't let go of that bitterness and that victim mentality, there are people that we talk to this day that their great-great-grandparents, right, were angry and bitter about something that happened to them, and it's still bleeding on generations.
Bitterness, I used to say this in recovery a lot, bitterness and resentment will just eat you from the inside out. It destroys a life quicker than any drug, quicker than any disease. It is a disease. Yeah. It just really is. And man, if you can get that out and keep that from taking over your life, that's the way to go for sure. And
generations will be better because of it.
100%.
Generations will prosper and be a lot better off.
Because this is something about that it just follows the generations. And if you live a life of bitterness and unforgiveness, your kids will, and your kids until somebody says enough's enough.
This was how my grandpa was. This is how my dad was. This is just how I am. This is how my son's going to be. It doesn't have to be.
Doesn't have to be.
Does not have to be. So I appreciate you coming in for the conversation.
Yeah, for real.
We have had so many, and I've always appreciated it, and I appreciate you. You've had such an impact on the direction of my life. I think with that, we're going to close out. So we thank you for listening to Escaping the Chains podcast. Please give us a follow on wherever you listen to your podcast. We want to thank RJ and the Delivered Media team. He's the man behind the curtain, and he's the one that makes this happen.
Yeah, so good.
Go check out Bethel's page so you can see when all your updates on Fanning the Flame and everything else they have going on. And we're going to actually close out with a song from BWC Music. And we will actually talk to you guys next Monday.